To think that many of the things we consider fundamental to good nursing and even just, a healthy home environment weren't always common knowledge.
Hmm.
These principles that underpin modern care, they have a surprisingly recent history, really shaped by some truly sharp minds.
Absolutely. And today, we're really plunging into, well, the foundational text for so much of this Florence Nightingale's Notes on Nursing, what it is and what it is not.
Now, this isn't some like dry historical document we're talking about. This is a firsthand look at how a real visionary thought about health and caregiving almost 170 years ago.
Right.
And our deep dive today, it's based on this fascinating 1946 reproduction of the original 1859 edition. It's from a copy held at the Library of Congress with details checked against the British Museum's version.
Yeah, and it even found its way to the UCLA library, apparently as a gift. So, quite a history to the physical copy itself.
So, what was Nightingale's core message with this book? What was she trying to achieve?
Well, her goal wasn't really to create a rigid how to guide. As she put it, she wanted to offer hints for thought, specifically to women who have personal charge of the health of others.
Hints for thought. I like that.
And what's really striking is her recognition that essentially every woman has, at one time or another of her life, charge of the personal health of somebody.
Ah.
So in her eyes, that made almost every woman a nurse in some capacity.
Okay, let's unpack this. So she wasn't just talking to people in starched uniforms in hospitals.
Not at all.
She was addressing mothers, daughters, sisters. I mean, anyone looking after the well-being of someone else, maybe just at home.
Precisely. It was much broader.
And our mission today is basically to extract the really timeless, insightful stuff from her work, the principles that, still matter for understanding what makes us healthy and how to care for those around us.
Right. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive straight into something she saw as absolutely non-negotiable. The very air we breathe.
Indeed, for Nightingale, the quality of the air he breathes, meaning the patient, was paramount. Absolutely number one.
And her central idea.
It was incredibly clear to keep the air he breathes as pure as the external air without chilling him.
It sounds so straightforward, doesn't it? Pure air, don't make them cold.
It does. But she quickly points out that even when people do give ventilation a thought, which maybe wasn't often, there's often a real lack of understanding about what it truly means.
So?
Well, what's fascinating is how vividly she illustrates the danger of stale air. She paints this almost dramatic picture of a murderer lurking in an unaired room, the foul air itself.
A murderer, wow.
Yeah, and the victim, the patient, is completely unaware of this invisible threat. It's quite graphic.
That's a powerful analogy. And she even noticed conflicts happening in hospitals back then.
She observed physicians and surgeons wanting to keep windows shut, probably for warmth or maybe just habit,
Right.
while the house surgeons, who were generally the more junior surgical staff, closer to the patients day to day, would come along and throw them open again.
So a bit of a battle over the windows.
Exactly. And this really underscores a major misconception she was battling. The idea that prioritizing warmth in a ward was more critical than having fresh air circulating.
Which seems counterintuitive now, maybe.
She argued very forcefully that making sick people constantly rebreathe their own warm, humid air actually slowed down their recovery and could even, well, destroy life, as she put it.
And it wasn't just the hospitals, right? She looked at homes, too.
Yes, she observed that bedrooms, no matter the social standing of the occupants, were almost universally stuffy and unhealthy. Foul, she often called them.
Foul. Okay.
She even mentioned something called Angus Smith's air test. This is a relatively new method at the time for actually measuring the quality of the air.
Like a scientific test.
Yeah, and Nightingale saw it as a potentially invaluable tool. Her point was, just as you'd check the temperature before giving someone a bath, you should assess the air quality before subjecting a patient to it.
But it's a delicate balancing act, isn't it? You want that fresh air, but you certainly don't want to make a vulnerable person feel even colder.
Exactly. She really emphasizes the risk of chilling patients who are already weak, especially in those early morning hours, like 4 or 5 a.m., when their vital powers are lowest.
Why then specifically?
Well, their energy is lowest then. The nourishment from the previous day has worn off. She noted that someone with a fever might feel burning up at night but be shivering with cold come morning.
Ah, okay. So when you air out a room is just as important as that you air it out.
Precisely. She stresses the need to be really mindful of the timing to avoid creating drafts, particularly when patients are sweating or are exposed while being washed or changed.
Makes sense.
Interestingly, she even mentions that the air in London was often at its freshest, she thought, after 10 p.m.
That's a surprising little tidbit. So get those windows open, but be smart about it.
Be smart about it. And her basic advice is pretty blunt. Windows are made to open, doors are made to shut.
Meaning,
Meaning, air the room from the outside air, not by pulling in air from the hallway, which might have cooking smells or fumes from lamps or just other stale air.
right, keep the inside door shut while the window's open.
Exactly. And she tackles other culprits of indoor air pollution too, like smoky chimneys.
Oh, yeah, that must have been common.
Very.
That's
Her observation was that most smoky chimneys could actually be fixed from the bottom by making sure there was a proper inlet for air to feed the fire. It wasn't always the chimney itself.
interesting. And it's not just the obvious sources of bad air, is it?
No, she points out how seemingly harmless things like drying damp towels in the same room as a patient can actually pollute the air, the moisture, the smell.
Little things add up.
They do. And she was quite firm in her condemnation of simply hiding soiled items like bedpans or dressings in the sick room, maybe under the bed or in a cupboard,
Out of sight, out of mind.
but not out of the air. She noted this offered really inadequate and dangerous protection because of what she called noxious effluvia, basically, the harmful fumes and smells coming off them. Sometimes, she thought, the waste products were even more dangerous than the patient's breath.
Yikes. Okay, so from the air inside the room, she then turns her attention to the very structure we live in, looking at what makes for a truly healthy house.
Yes, she identifies three core elements: pure air, pure water, and effective drainage. Pretty fundamental stuff.
Pure air, pure water, good drainage.
And she argues that the overall health of a house is directly tied to how good these three things are. A direct proportion, she says.
And she wasn't exactly impressed with how many houses were being built at the time, was she?
No. She observed that often those constructing houses were more concerned with, well, profit than with ensuring the health of the people who would be living there.
Especially regarding air circulation.
Exactly. Things like back-to-back housing or lack of through drafts, making it hard for air to move properly.
Water quality was another huge concern, particularly with the constant threat of epidemics like cholera.
Oh, absolutely. She really emphasizes the danger of using contaminated water sources, like wells near cesspits, pointing out that people using such water were almost certain to become ill when disease struck.
Makes sense. And just because there's a sewer in the street doesn't automatically mean your house has good drainage, right?
That's a crucial distinction she makes. It's not enough to just have a sewer nearby. She explains how untrapped drain pipes, pipes from toilets, sinks, or even cellar drains that directly connected to the main sewer could essentially turn that sewer into a pipeline, funneling disease right back into the house through the foul air.
So the connection itself could be the problem if not done right.
Exactly. Traps were essential.
And even in a house that looks clean on the surface, there can be hidden dangers to the air quality. She talks about dust.
She stresses that dust and furniture that isn't properly cleaned are significant sources of air impurities. She compares it rather vividly to having a dung heap in the basement.
Point taken.
She observed that people often just accepted illness as fate, it was God's will or something, rather than actively thinking about how their own home environment might be contributing.
And those cozy habits like blocking up fireplaces in rooms you weren't using, definitely not something Nightingale would recommend.
Absolutely not. She advises against ever blocking chimneys, suggesting instead that they should be regularly swept, even if unused. Her point was that sealing up a room is the absolute best way to make the air inside foul. Keep it aired, keep it swept.
It's quite sobering to hear her observation about hospital pyemia, this severe blood poisoning often linked to unsanitary conditions occurring even in handsome private houses.
Yes, because of foul air, often for those drainage issues or lack of ventilation. And yet, she laments, people often didn't seem to learn the lesson.
She contrasts the unhealthy homes of her era with what she saw as the better aired houses of earlier times.
Right. She talks about previous generations where maybe doors and windows were open more, and there was perhaps more rigorous cleaning. She suggests that the decline in overall health across generations, which some people were noticing, might be partly due to this shift towards stuffier, less clean living conditions.
Interesting. She even shares a really striking story about three maids.
Oh, yes. 3 maids who all got scarlet fever while sleeping in the same poorly ventilated attic room. She uses it to illustrate that the spread of disease wasn't always some mysterious, unaccountable event.
It was accountable if you looked at the conditions.
Exactly. A simple look, and likely, as she implies, a single breath of the air in that room would have told you a lot about the risk.
Nightingale then moves on to a concept she calls petty management, which, might sound trivial, but she argues is absolutely essential when caring for the sick.
It sounds small, petty, but it's about the details.
Hmm.
What's really insightful here is her emphasis on thinking ahead. Anticipation.
Thinking ahead, how so?
She stresses the importance of considering what happens when the person providing care isn't physically present in the room. It's about foresight.
Ah, okay. Like what?
For example, she points out that keeping things quiet is just as vital at 10 p.m. as it is earlier in the day, regardless of whether the nurse is in the room or has stepped out. The patient's need for quiet doesn't stop when the caregiver leaves.
So it's about setting up systems and anticipating needs, not just reacting or being there every single minute.
Precisely. Poor planning or lack of this petty management can lead to inappropriate visitors disturbing a patient or crucial messages being overlooked simply because no one had thought about these possibilities beforehand and made arrangements.
Right. She even uses the lingering smell of paint as an example.
Yes, an example of poor management when it comes to ventilation. If you have windows available but don't think to open them to get rid of fumes after painting, that's a failure in managing the environment effectively.
Makes sense.
And she advises against ever surprising patients. Always knock, approach gently, and make sure a reliable person is designated to answer the door so the patient isn't startled or disturbed unnecessarily.
And letting patients know when you'll be back.
Crucial. It prevents them from unnecessary worry or perhaps expending precious energy trying to listen for your return or get ready for you.
She highlights the importance of what she calls speed without hurry when doing things for someone who is sick.
Yes, efficiency, but calmness. Not frantic rushing, which can be alarming, but not slow dawdling either. It applies to both physical tasks and how you communicate.
And she makes the point that when things go wrong because someone wasn't there, the response shouldn't just be, oh, I need to be there more.
Right. The response should be to figure out solutions for future absences. How can we ensure this doesn't happen again when I'm not here? It's about creating dependable systems of care, not just increasing presence.
Interestingly, she observes that this idea of petty management is often better understood in institutions, hospitals, workhouses.
Yes, with the notable exception, she says, of military hospitals at that time.
Ah, right. Her Crimean War experience must have shaped that view.
Clearly. She shares some quite concerning stories, anecdotes, about fatal accidents that occurred in military hospitals due to a lack of organized and dependable attendance by trustworthy individuals.
And she contrasts this with civilian hospitals.
Yes, particularly those nursed by women, where she felt this kind of thoughtful management and reliable care was more common.
She even explains why the common military practice of patients nursing each other in regimental hospitals was, in her view, inadequate.
And undesirable. It simply lacked the focused responsibility, the specific skills, and the constant reliable attention needed for proper care. It wasn't real nursing.
So then she shifts the focus to the mindset of the caregiver.
Yes, emphasizing the need to always be thinking, how can I ensure the right things are done for this patient consistently, even when I'm not physically present?
It really boils down to each person understanding and fulfilling their specific role, doesn't it?
Exactly, especially when you're caring for an individual patient at home, where having too many people involved without clear roles can actually lead to less precise and focused care. Things fall through the cracks.
Right. It's about clear lines of responsibility and ensuring consistent attention to the patient's needs.
That's the core of petty management.
Next, Nightingale delves into the impact of noise on the sick, something that I think we probably still underestimate in its effect today.
Oh, definitely. She emphasizes just how damaging noise can be, particularly noise that is unnecessary. That's a key distinction for her.
Unnecessary noise versus necessary noise.
Yes. She argues that even if a necessary sound, like maybe moving the patient, is louder, an unnecessary noise like rustling clothes or whispering is actually more harmful because it signals a lack of care or thought.
So it's the meaning behind the noise, too. She talks about these mysterious affinities and aversions that patients often have.
And suggests they frequently come down to whether or not their caregiver is being thoughtful about noise, whether their need for quiet is being respected. It builds trust or destroys it.
What's really striking is her description of the horror of a rustling nurse. That's strong language.
It is. She goes into detail about how the sound of, say, Stiff starched aprons or silk clothing rubbing together, keys jingling on a belt, even shoes creaking can be absolute torture for a sick person. And she says, do more harm than any medicine does good.
Wow. And those hushed conversations that people often have in a sick person's room, thinking they're being considerate.
Apparently, those can be incredibly stressful because they force the patient to strain their attention involuntarily, trying to make out what's being said, which is exhausting. Better to speak normally outside the room or clearly and briefly within it.
So, even seemingly insignificant, unnecessary noises can be genuinely harmful.
That's her point. Injury, she calls it.
Simple things like making sure window blinds are fully up and secured when not needed to block light can actually make a difference.
Absolutely. Avoids flapping or rattling noises. And she stresses that sudden interruptions of thought are damaging.
Interruptions of thought.
Yes,
Yeah.
because the very act of thinking, she believed, uses up nervous energy, literally decomposes nervous matter, she theorized. Starting a new train of thought after an interruption requires even more exertion from a weakened patient.
That's a fascinating physiological take on it. She even cautions against making patients stand up, even for a very short period.
Yes, unless absolutely necessary and supported. She observed that patients often seem to be able to do more when they are alone
Why is that?
because they dread the sudden surprise of someone entering and the expectation, spoken or unspoken, that they will exert themselves, sit up straighter, answer questions, engage for the caregiver's convenience or perceived need.
That's a really insightful look into the patient's experience. It suggests a need for real sensitivity from the caregiver.
Absolutely. And she advises that after an animated conversation, maybe with a visitor, you should return quietly a bit later to really see how the patient is doing, rather than judging their state during the temporary excitement of the moment.
Because the effects might show up later.
Exactly. The effects of exertion often don't show up immediately. They appear afterwards, maybe as fatigue or increased pain. So observe later.
She emphasizes the importance of entering and leaving a sick room quickly but not abruptly.
Right. Don't linger unnecessarily, making the patient feel watched or obliged to talk, but don't startle them with sudden movements either. And avoid making the patient wait anxiously for you.
Being concise and decisive in both your movements and your words is key then.
Yes. No fidgeting, no indecisiveness. It reduces the mental effort required from the patient. And she highlights the added burden on the patient if they have to worry about whether the nurse will be on time or remember things or be generally reliable. That worry itself is harmful.
Noise coming from overhead seems to have been a significant problem, even with the way houses were built then.
Oh, yes. She notes the considerable suffering caused by noise and vibrations from rooms above, especially in, as she saw it, increasingly flimsy modern construction.
Her solution.
If quiet can't be ensured otherwise, she suggests that patients who are particularly sensitive to noise should be placed on the top floor of the house, if possible.
Makes sense. Finally, she touches on the often overlooked impact of music on the sick. She had some specific ideas.
She did. She observes that wind instruments and continuous stringed instruments like maybe a cello or violin played smoothly tend to be generally beneficial, soothing.
Not all music.
Whereas the piano, with its more percussive nature and instruments that don't have that sustained sound, can actually be detrimental, possibly agitating. Interestingly, she notes that simple, familiar melodies are often more soothing than complex or technically brilliant performances. Keep it simple.
Moving on to another crucial aspect, Nightingale discusses the importance of variety for those who are sick, especially during long periods of being confined.
Yes, she really emphasizes how the sheer monotony, the sameness of the same four walls, the same view day after day, can have a profound negative impact on the nerves of someone who is ill.
To a degree that healthy people maybe don't get.
Exactly. To a degree that's really difficult for healthy people, busy with their own lives, to fully appreciate. She contrasts the often surprising cheerfulness you sometimes see in people with acute pain, with the low spirits common in those suffering from long-term nervous debility or chronic illness. She suggests it's partly because the moments of relief from pain allow the first group to actually enjoy the change, the interval, whereas the chronically ill just have the unchanging weakness.
So even small changes in their environment can have a real therapeutic effect.
Absolutely. She states it quite clearly.
Yeah.
Variety of form and brilliancy of color in the objects presented to patients are actual means of recovery.
Actual means of recovery, that's strong.
It is. However, she cautions that introducing this variety needs to be done slowly and gradually. You don't want to overwhelm a weak patient with too much stimulation all at once. Gentle change.
And what about flowers in the sick room? That's often a topic of debate even today. Are they healthy? Do they use up oxygen, etc.?
Nightingale actually dismisses what she calls the folly and ignorance surrounding flowers. She saw their benefit clearly,
Which was?
primarily their shapes and colors. They provide a welcome, gentle distraction from painful thoughts or the monotony of the room, something beautiful and natural to focus on. She also points out the relief that natural light can bring,
Right. We'll get more into light later.
noting that the longing for daylight is often, fundamentally, a desire for the visual variety it offers, the way it changes the appearance of things in the room.
Even the lack of their usual activities, their work or hobbies, can take a significant mental toll.
Yes, she discusses how engaging in manual labor, for many people back then, provided a sense of relief and purpose. Being deprived of this, she suggests, is a significant loss for the sick, who are similarly cut off from their normal routines and interests. It's a form of deprivation.
She uses a really poignant example, doesn't she, about a man with a spinal injury.
Oh, yes, a man who desperately wanted just to see out of the window. He couldn't be moved easily, but the sheer intensity of his craving for that simple change of view illustrates the powerful need for variety that sick individuals can experience.
It really highlights how vital these seemingly minor changes in scenery can be for their mental well-being.
Definitely. She then transitions from mental variety to the really crucial topic of nourishment, or taking food, as her chapter is titled.
Making sure weak patients get the right food at the right time seems to be a recurring and very important theme in her notes. It comes up again and again.
It does. She strongly advises against trying to tempt weak patients with large amounts of food all at once, bringing in a big tray thinking it looks appealing.
Why not?
Because it can actually overwhelm them visually and mentally, making them less likely to eat anything at all, either then or later. Small and manageable is key.
So instead,
She emphasizes the importance of providing small, frequent, and easily digestible nourishment, little bits, often. Especially, she stresses, in the hours before 11 a.m., when she felt patients often had the most capacity to digest.
and the timing of these small meals is absolutely critical, particularly for those who are very weak.
Absolutely critical. She explains that there's often a nervous difficulty in swallowing, a real physical challenge for the very weak. Any delay in offering food, even by minutes, can mean the window of opportunity when they could have swallowed is missed.
So punctuality is paramount.
Almost down to the minute, she implies. You need to anticipate and coincide with the patient's fleeting moments of strength or appetite. She points out quite starkly that in chronic illnesses, patients can actually be starved to death, simply through neglect of timely and appropriate feeding. Not malice, just lack of attention to this detail.
Wow. Even the social aspect of mealtimes needs careful consideration.
Yes, she advises against bringing up business matters, anxieties, or even engaging in overly stimulating or interesting conversations with someone who is sick while they're eating, or immediately before or after their meals.
Why?
To avoid any sense of mental stress, hurry, or distraction that could interfere with their ability to eat and digest, keep meal times calm and focused on the food.
She also goes into some detail about different types of nourishment, clarifying the nutritional content of things like arrowroot.
Right, which she points out is mainly starch and water, not hugely nutritious on its own.
Versus flour, which is better, and highlighting the importance of milk and butter in a sick person's diet.
Yes, she valued milk highly. But what's particularly interesting is her observation, based clearly on her extensive experience, about patient craving.
Cravings.
She notes that patients suffering from illnesses related to food, or maybe digestive issues, sometimes develop cravings for, and are actually able to digest, foods that would typically be considered entirely unsuitable.
Like,
She mentions things like certain fruits, pickles, even fatty foods, things that might seem counterintuitive. Her point is that the patient's own body, their stomach's opinion, as she puts it, can sometimes be a better guide than standard dietary rules or the book.
trust the patient's instincts sometimes.
Within reason, yes. Observe carefully. She also notes, interestingly, that there can be differences in how quickly men and women digest food, something maybe not often considered.
Even something as seemingly simple as preparing tea gets her attention.
Oh, yes. She stresses the importance of including that small amount of milk in tea. For many English patients, it was expected and perhaps even aided digestion or comfort.
And beef tea. That was a staple sickroom food.
It was. But she mentions the observations of a Dr. Christensen who questioned its actual nutritional value, suggesting it was perhaps more of a stimulant or provided hydration rather than significant nourishment. She's questioning the received wisdom.
And it's not just about what you eat, but also the form it's presented in. She talks about bread.
hmm She shares anecdotes of patients who couldn't tolerate commercially baked bread, baker's bread, but thrived on homemade bread or brown bread. Again, emphasizing the importance of paying attention to individual preferences and reactions.
Her key message seems to be observe the patient.
Exactly. Observing how the patient's digestive system responds is far more important than just looking at nutritional analyses on paper. The patient's stomach knows best, often.
The nurse then plays a really vital role in understanding these individual dietary nuances, maybe more so than the doctor who pops in briefly.
Absolutely. Medical professionals often have limited time for that kind of detailed ongoing observation. The nurse's constant presence and careful attention to the patient's reactions to food, the timing, the preferences, it's incredibly valuable, essential information.
And the timing of that cup of tea can really make a difference to sleep, apparently.
Yes, she notes that a cup of tea given early in the morning, maybe around 5 a.m., can often relieve sleeplessness that's caused by sheer exhaustion. It acts as a gentle restorative.
But not later in the day.
Generally, she advises avoiding it after 5 p.m., as it can contribute to a different kind of sleeplessness, one caused by overstimulation or excitement. Interestingly, she adds that a renewed desire for tea can be a positive sign of recovery in patients with typhus.
Specific observations like that are fascinating. She cautions against simply diluting nourishing drinks, like beef tea or arrowroot, just to make them go further or seem easier to take.
Right. Diluting a nutritious drink doesn't actually increase its benefit and can even overwhelm the patient's system with too much liquid for too little substance. Careful observation is needed to determine the right consistency and the appropriate amount to give at one time.
Little details matter, even coffee prep.
Yes. She stresses the importance of grinding coffee beans at home to avoid the common practice back then of adding chicory, which was often used as a filler but lacks the stimulating properties of real coffee. Get the real stuff.
And all this relates back to rest. Even the state of the bed itself is a crucial factor in her view.
Absolutely. She highlights the importance of a well-made and well-slept-in bed, meaning clean, comfortable, and properly aired. She connects the nurse's responsibility for the room's environment directly to the patient's ability to sleep.
Some nurses didn't see the connection.
Apparently not always. Some didn't seem to connect the state of the room's stuffy air, uncomfortable bed with the patient's sleeplessness. She even mentions the ideal height for the patient's head in relation to the chimney opening for optimal air quality while sleeping. Very specific.
Wow. And the height of the bed can impact more than just sleep.
Yes, she points out how the difference in height between a bed and, say, a sofa can affect a patient's ability to easily get in and out of bed, which impacts their ability to get even minimal exercise. Practicalities.
And she reminds us that patients confined to bed actually have to get in and out far more frequently than healthy individuals.
Right, for washing, for toilet needs, for changing position. So the ease of doing so is really important for conserving their strength.
Nightingale then turns her attention to the power of light, emphasizing that its effects go far beyond just allowing us to see. It's not just about vision.
No, she argues that light has very real and tangible effects on the body, physical effects. She even compares the sun not just to a painter adding color, but also to a sculptor influencing form and health. And she discusses the purifying effect of light, especially direct sunlight, on the air within a room.
So keeping the shutters closed in a sick room is definitely something she strongly advises against. Dark rooms are unhealthy rooms.
Strongly. She condemns keeping shutters habitually closed in rooms where someone is sick or even in bedrooms that are unoccupied, as it inevitably creates a stale, close, and musty atmosphere, unhealthy air.
And she identifies the sources of that musty smell.
Yes, primarily stagnant, unchanged air, and secondly, the organic exhalations from people and animals and their waste that have been absorbed by the walls, carpets, and furnishings over time.
So what does she recommend for walls in a sick room?
Ideally, she suggests using materials that are non-absorbent and easily washable. Pure white cement, glass, or glazed tiles are mentioned as good options because they don't hold on to those impurities and reflect light well.
Because the air itself soils the room.
Exactly. Just like water becomes polluted by use, the air we breathe soils the room, she argues. And in poorly ventilated spaces, the walls and carpets become saturated with these impurities from our breath and bodies.
She breaks down 3 primary ways that rooms become unclean, right?
Firstly, through dirty air coming from outside, things like sewer gases drifting in, street dust, smoke from chimneys.
Okay.
Secondly, from impurities generated within the room itself, primarily our own breath and bodily exhalations.
Right.
And thirdly, simply from a general lack of cleanliness in the articles and surfaces within the room, dirty bedding, unwashed furniture, dust. She even advocates for covering house walls generally with plain or decorative tiles as a way to improve light, cleanliness, dryness, warmth, and even long-term economy.
Interesting idea. And there can be hidden dangers lurking in our decor beyond just dirt.
Yes. She mentions the degradation or breakdown that occurs from most materials, other than those that are hard, polished, or glazed like tiles or glass. And she cites a specific alarming example.
Mm.
Arsenic found in the dust from some popular green wallpapers of the time.
Arsenic in wallpaper.
Yes, it was used in the pigment, and the dust containing arsenic could be inhaled or absorbed. She compares this to administering a slow poison by mouth, a hidden danger in the home.
And she stresses that poisoning through the skin, or presumably inhalation, is just as certain as poisoning by mouth.
It just happens more slowly, she says, making it perhaps more insidious.
Even basic hygiene practices like washing the skin take on a deeper significance when someone is ill, in her view.
Absolutely. She highlights the noticeable relief and comfort that the sick often experience after their skin has been carefully washed and dried. She sees this not just as cleaning, but as a sign that their vital functions, their vital powers, are being relieved and supported.
And she recommends washing with soap and soft water for benefits beyond just getting dirt off.
Yes, even when water is scarce, like maybe on a long sea voyage, she notes the benefit of washing. The skin absorbs some water, becomes softer, and is better able to perspire, which is a key bodily function for regulation and elimination. Soap helps this process.
Nightingale then turns her attention to what she calls chattering hopes and advices, which sounds intriguing. It focuses on the often well-meaning but sometimes quite harmful things that people say to someone who is sick.
Exactly. It's about communication. She urges visitors, friends, and even attendants to stop doing two things. First, making light of the sick person's danger, pretending it's not serious.
Downplaying it.
Yes. And second, exaggerating their chances of recovery, offering false hope. She felt both were unhelpful and often distressing to the patient, who usually has a clearer sense of their own condition than people think.
And she notes that doctors were becoming more honest.
Yes, she observed that medical professionals are increasingly being more truthful with patients who genuinely want to know what their prognosis is. She sees this as a positive trend.
Unsolicited opinions seem to be a particular frustration for her, especially from people who don't know the full story.
Oh, definitely. She strongly criticizes friends and even other medical men who aren't directly involved in the case, who barge in and offer their opinions without truly understanding the individual patient's condition or the treatment plan.
Interfering, basically.
Yes. She points out how a sick person can often feel quite isolated and misunderstood despite being surrounded by these well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful friends. She does acknowledge some exceptions, though, like offering standard reassurance to first-time mothers that their symptoms and experiences are normal and part of the process. That kind of informed reassurance is different.
And those often absurd statistical comparisons people make to try and cheer up someone who is ill. My cousin had something much worse and he's fine now.
She takes direct aim at these. Things like comparing recovery from completely different diseases and different types of people. She highlights the need for truly relevant, precise comparisons, if any are made at all, considering factors like age, sex, the specific disease, severity, etc. Otherwise, it's meaningless and often just annoying.
And she underscores how impertinent it is to give advice when you admit you don't even know the full details of the situation.
Right. People who say, I haven't inquired into the particulars, but you should definitely try this. It's absurd, she implies.
She has some specific warnings for nurses about different types of visitors or advisors they might encounter.
Yes. She advises nurses to be wary of visitors who pull them aside and say things like, your patient looks fine, they just need cheering up, ignoring the reality. Or conversely, they seem suicidal, you must watch them constantly, potentially causing unnecessary alarm, or even their case is hopeless, prepare for the worst. All potentially harmful perspectives.
Sometimes the best form of comfort isn't necessarily logical or verbal, she suggests.
She suggests that simply having a baby nearby, its quiet presence and innocence, can often bring a sick person more comfort and calm than any amount of well-intentioned reasoning or advice.
Interesting. And she points out that sick people often suffer disproportionately from things that might seem like minor causes of distress to a healthy person.
Yes, small worries, minor inconveniences, little anxieties can loom large when you're ill. She urges caregivers to pay attention to and address these seemingly small issues, as they can have a big impact on the patient's peace of mind.
Keeping someone who is sick connected to what's happening in the outside world seems important for maintaining that perspective, too.
Definitely. She advises bringing the sick person into contact with current events and real world interests, reading the newspaper to them, discussing actual happenings to help restore their sense of proportion and take their mind off themselves. But, she stresses, real interests, not just idle gossip, which she thinks is harmful.
She also notes a couple of emerging types of patients in her time, particularly among wealthier women.
Yes, she identifies two new categories where her general advice might not apply as much. First, those who seem to use ill health as an excuse for chronic inactivity and avoidance of any useful occupation.
Okay. And the second?
Those who overindulge in a constant round of social amusements and distractions, often disguised as intellectual activity, which she felt could be just as draining. She specifically advises against telling the first type, the inactive ones, to just vegetate. That's not the answer either.
Finally, she draws a crucial distinction between different kinds of inaccurate information that caregivers might provide.
Right. She differentiates between simply having defective observation, not noticing things correctly, and actively engaging in what she calls imaginative misinformation.
What's the difference?
The latter is far more dangerous because it involves presenting falsehoods as truth, often with great confidence. She shares anecdotes of wildly inaccurate observations that were nonetheless confidently asserted and even confirmed by multiple equally unobservant people, spreading wrong information actively.
Which leads perfectly into her next major section, the crucial skill of observation of the sick.
Yes, a cornerstone of her entire philosophy. She explains that even when the person you're asking has information about a patient, using vague leading questions often doesn't yield any truly useful answers.
Like asking.
Like the classic, did he have a good night? Different people, the nurse, the patient, the doctor, will have completely different ideas of what constitutes a good night. It's too subjective. Did they sleep? For how long? Were they restless? In pain? You need specifics.
So it's really up to the person providing care, the nurse or the attentive friend or family member, to be the careful observer, not just the asker.
Absolutely. She stresses that the nurse should be actively observing and making note of facts and details, exactly how much food the patient ate and when, their sleep patterns, duration, quality, the nature and quantity of any bodily discharges, changes in complexion or breathing, not just relying on the patient's possibly vague or subjective reports.
She uses asking a general question about diarrhea as another example.
Right. Just asking, has he had diarrhea?
Yeah.
Isn't enough. How many times? What was the nature of it? When did it occur? The details matter for diagnosis and treatment.
She even cheekily suggests that doctors might get more accurate insights if they sometimes avoided speaking to the patient's friends altogether.
Because she felt friends often unintentionally misrepresent the patient's condition, sometimes making it sound worse due to anxiety, sometimes better due to wishful thinking. Their reports can be unreliable filters.
And she emphasizes that when it comes to infants who can't speak for themselves, everything hinges on the accurate observation and reporting of the nurse or the mother.
A condition she laments that is rarely fulfilled adequately. The skill of precise observation of babies was lacking, she felt.
She shares a fascinating little exercise for honing observational skills involving a toy shop.
Yes. She recounts a story, perhaps apocryphal, of a father teaching his son, who became a prominent politician, Robert Peel, observation by having them quickly walk past a shop window, then list everything they saw, and then go back to check their accuracy. A practical way to train the eye and memory.
And she suggests this kind of training would be invaluable for nurses.
Invaluable. While simply observing isn't the only thing that makes a good nurse, it's definitely foundational. She asserts that while observation alone doesn't make someone a useful nurse, a nurse who lacks the ability to observe carefully is actually dangerous.
Because they miss crucial signs.
They miss crucial signs, or they report inaccurate information, leading to wrong decisions. She also points out that almost all superstitions stem from faulty observation, incorrectly linking events just because one followed another. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc.
She talks about a physiognomy of disease, a way that illness manifests in someone's appearance that experienced nurses can learn to recognize.
Yes, the subtle changes in complexion, expression, posture, breathing that indicate certain states or changes in condition. But she cautions that those who are inexperienced often misinterpret these visual signs. You need practice and knowledge.
She mentions how seasoned nurses can sometimes detect narcotic use.
Yes, simply by subtle changes in facial color or the look of the eyes, something a less trained observer would likely miss entirely. She criticizes giving generic, commonplace advice to the sick based on just a superficial glance without real observation.
Even medical professionals, focused as they are on diagnosis, can sometimes have observational blind spots, she argues.
Yes, she explains that professionals who primarily focus on physical changes that can be felt or measured, palpable organic changes, can sometimes miss the overall picture just as much as someone who doesn't observe at all.
Using the example of a broken leg.
Right. You can fix the leg perfectly, but if the patient dies from exhaustion due to lack of sleep, poor air, or inadequate nutrition caused by the whole situation, the focus on just the organic lesion was incomplete. She highlights that death can often be the result of a gradual accumulation of exhaustion from multiple underlying issues, not just one obvious disease.
Which makes the common verdict of no organic disease potentially quite misleading.
Exactly. She criticizes this finding because, while technically true perhaps, it often completely ignores the conditions necessary for recovery: quiet, proper nutrition, fresh air, which may be impossible to achieve in the patient's current circumstances. The lack of organic disease doesn't mean the patient will get better if the conditions for recovery aren't met.
She shares several anecdotes of incorrect diagnoses or prognoses that stemmed from this lack of thorough, holistic observation.
Yes, cases where underlying conditions or the cumulative effect of smaller problems were missed.
She even suggests a rather unconventional, perhaps radical idea for life insurance companies back then.
Instead of relying solely on the standard medical examination of the applicant, she proposes that they should also assess the living conditions and the overall healthiness of the applicant's house and lifestyle,
Why?
because she argued that this would provide a much more accurate assessment of their actual life expectancy and risk than just a quick physical checkup. Environment matters hugely.
And relying on averages, like average rates of mortality, can also hide important individual factors.
Definitely. She explains that these averages don't tell you anything about an individual's likelihood of survival. Meticulous observation of their specific conditions, their home, their habits, their care, is absolutely essential for any real understanding or prediction.
So, a high rate of death or illness in a particular house or family shouldn't be dismissed as bad luck.
No, it's a strong indicator, a red flag, pointing to underlying unhealthy conditions: bad drainage, poor ventilation, contaminated water, unhealthy habits that need to be investigated and addressed.
These patterns of illness and death can even repeat across generations within a family or location.
She notes how the same family names might appear repeatedly in workhouse admission records over generations, pointing to the continuation of conditions that lead to poverty and likely ill health. Similarly, she observes, patterns of specific diseases and premature death often follow predictable paths within families and particular houses due to shared environments and lifestyles.
She even asserts that close observation over time can help predict the decline or even extinction of a family line if conditions aren't improved.
It sounds harsh, but it reflects her belief in the powerful link between environment, habits, and long-term health outcomes.
A high rate of children dying in a particular house is a particularly stark warning sign for her.
Yes, she uses the tragic example of multiple infant or child deaths in a single home as a very clear signal, almost a message from Providence. She implies that the conditions within that home are fundamentally harmful and require urgent change. It's not just fate, it's cause and effect.
Finally, in this section, she urges caregivers, nurses, and doctors alike to always see the patients as a whole person, not just as a medical case to be observed dispassionately.
Yes, she cautions strongly against treating the sick merely as interesting cases for detached scientific observation, neglecting their comfort, their anxieties, their overall well-being in the process.
Using the analogy of suspected poisoning.
Right. If you suspect someone is being poisoned, the immediate priority isn't just to scientifically observe the symptoms, but to remove the source of the poison. Similarly, if a patient is suffering due to bad air or lack of quiet, the priority is to fix those conditions, not just observe the results.
She concludes this vital section by outlining the key qualities of someone who makes a truly good nurse, synthesizing many of these points.
Yes, it's a powerful summary. She lists essential traits such as being discreet, no gossip, only answering questions to those who have a genuine right to ask, like the doctor, being sober and honest, having a sense of religious devotion or deep commitment to their work, respecting the calling of nursing, being a quick and attentive observer, and possessing both sensitivity, delicate feeling, and good moral character, decent feeling. It's a high standard. It really is. So, as we bring our deep dive into Notes on Nursing toward a close, what are some of the key takeaways from Nightingale's concluding thoughts? How does she wrap things up?
Well, first, she reiterates that her notes are not intended as a comprehensive nursing textbook, a complete manual. They are, as she said at the start, a collection of hints for thought, reminders of principles.
And she still believes real practical skills need hands on learning.
Yes, she maintains her strong belief that practical nursing skills are best acquired in a hospital setting through apprenticeship and particularly through observing experienced nurses, especially the sisters, senior nurses or ward managers, in the great London hospitals whom she clearly admired.
And while the techniques of, say, surgical nursing might be refined over time, there are still fundamental issues that lead to preventable deaths. Even then, she emphasizes that point strongly. While surgical skills themselves might improve, many patients still die from basic factors like poor air quality in the recovery environment. It underscores the ongoing fundamental importance of these environmental and basic care principles she's been discussing. They aren't superseded by technical skill.
Children, she notes, are particularly vulnerable to these factors.
Yes. She discusses the heightened susceptibility of children to all these noxious influences: bad air, lack of cleanliness, poor nutrition. She stresses the need for even greater vigilance in addressing factors like air, warmth, light, and cleanliness for children compared to adults.
And foul air at night is especially bad for them.
She specifically highlights foul night air as particularly dangerous for children. She observes that disordered or difficult breathing in a sick child can become rapidly life-threatening in foul air, even if adults in the same room feel no particular discomfort. Their smaller systems are more easily overwhelmed.
Even in adults who are very weak, the basics like breathing really matter intensely.
Mhm. She points out that in extremely weakened adults, even something as fundamental and usually automatic as breathing can become almost a voluntary, conscious effort, highlighting again how vital pure air is when the body systems are struggling.
She then presents, quite powerfully, her central argument for the whole art and science of nursing. What is its purpose?
Fundamentally, she argues that nature alone cures. Disease is a process nature institutes to repair damage. The role of nursing, therefore, is not to cure, but to create the absolute best possible conditions, environmental and physical, for nature to be able to do its restorative work effectively.
So, nursing is about facilitating the body's own healing process.
Exactly, putting the patient in the best condition for nature to act upon him or her.
She also takes a moment to address some common misconceptions about who is suited to be a nurse, which were clearly prevalent then.
Oh, yes. She firmly refutes the idea that nursing is simply a job for women who are disappointed in love or have no other options in life. She compares this attitude to the absurdity of putting a pig keeper in charge of a school just because they need a job.
Uh huh. Okay.
True nursing, she argues passionately, requires specific skills, knowledge, intelligence, character, and dedication. A genuine vocation, not just a default occupation.
And she felt this sense of vocation was better understood elsewhere.
She notes that in Roman Catholic countries, with their established nursing orders of nuns, there tends to be a better cultural understanding of the commitment and calling involved in nursing.
And she offers some, well, rather timeless advice on focusing on what truly matters in life, perhaps reflecting her own deep sense of purpose.
She does. She urges her readers, particularly women seeking meaningful work, to ignore the fashionable jargons of the time regarding women's rights and roles, which she seemed to find distracting or superficial, and to instead focus on doing what she considers God's work with simplicity, humility, and a pure, single-minded heart. Do the work that needs doing.
So, as we wrap up this fascinating exploration of Nightingale's notes, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to maybe chew on?
Well, maybe consider this. Which of Nightingale's seemingly simple, almost common sense observations about fresh air, sunlight, quiet, cleanliness, careful feeding, thoughtful observation are perhaps the most overlooked or neglected in our own homes, hospitals, and communities today?
That's a good question.
And reflect on the potential impact if we were to consistently apply these fundamental principles. What difference could it make to our individual well-being and the overall health of our society? It's quite profound when you think about it.
It really is. Perhaps, as she intended, these notes still offer plenty of hints for thought.
I think they absolutely do. And maybe take some time to delve into Notes on Nursing yourself if you're interested. Its insights continue to be remarkably relevant over 160 years later.